Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Erik and I are real happy to have you on as we talk about the HIPAA Security Rule and AI and showing you ways that we've seen people succeed in using that. Um, we're going to give you an opportunity to ask questions. The way this is going to work is we're going to go into depth about a handful of topics about the HIPAA Security Rule and the proposed rule and how AI has been a challenge to our clients and what we've been working with our clients to solve. Uh, we'll take a moment so that you can ask questions about the material that we've got. Because the HIPAA security rule has so many aspects of it that might jump into AI, we're going to go through a lightning round to hit some of the maybe the easier things to address. But ask questions during this session and ask questions after. You'll have contact information. But we'd really love to hear from you if you have questions about what we're going to present. So, Erik, why don't you introduce yourself? I'll introduce myself, and we'll jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for HALOCK and for Reasonable Risk. I also am our practice lead for our cybersecurity solutions engineering and forensics team. Been with HALOCK for over 12 years now.
Okay, and I'm Chris Cronin. I'm a partner at HALOCK. I help run our governance, risk, and compliance team. Uh, the thing that I bring most often to the table is this concept of risk analysis to address reasonability. And if you know the HIPAA security rule, you know reasonable and appropriate is the standard. So we're going to talk about how you can use that phrase to your advantage as we set this up. Erik, you and Steve Lawn, a member of your team, have been holding this series of webinars, and there's a theme that keeps coming up, and it's basically this, right? The idea that AI, just you manage AI like you manage everything else. It seems mind-boggling as a technology, but there's a lot that you've been showing, you and Steve have been showing about how to just think about this as a normal technology, right? So you're going to secure your AI tools and services like every other tool service as your baseline. You're going to understand the risks that are particular to AI tools, and then refer back to rule number one, because if you allow yourself to be seduced by AI and think it has to have its like a brand new way of governing it, it can be overwhelming. So we're going to focus on good practical knowledge that should help you get through that. The things that we see people using in both clinical environments and then payer environments is looking at patient data using AI, sometimes not anonymizing it. That's not very safe, but we're seeing people do these things. But they're using it for research analysis, how to quickly get to a research answer by modeling what could happen in clinical trials or in lab experiments, using reimbursement, using AI for reimbursement scoring. So which of the bills can I best get reimbursed by an insurance carrier uh, or CMS? Patient care decision making. Hey, would this med conflict with that med? But people are just trying to get AI, very specialized AI, to handle these specialized things. We're also seeing it being used in patient portals to allow clients to ask questions about a care regimen or symptoms with AI giving them responses. Holy cow, you got to be careful with this stuff. But this is what we're seeing in terms of a clinical use or sometimes a payer use for using AI with patient information. Very quickly, we're talking about HIPAA both in terms of the most recent, well, omnibus rule, now 13 years old, but the HIPAA we've been living with, and the proposed rules that were issued by OCR in public comment. And what we're going to do is say, hey, this rule applies now, and this one applies now, and it will be like this for the proposed rule. So we want to be sure that you've got prep for that. Now, Erik, you're seeing a lot of the same kind of repeated issues with AI deployments. What are you seeing?
Yeah, most people are aware of this now, but and it's not specific to AI, but AI just exacerbates it because It's allowing more people with less skill to do more complex tasks at faster speeds, right? So problems that we see, shadow AI, people are spinning up their own AI agents using multitudes of AI, and you don't have visibility necessarily into what they're doing and what applications they're using, introduces risk. Um, Shared credentials, we've all known that you're not supposed to be sharing credentials across different applications for a long time. But an API key or a service account that gets exposed can unintentionally expose your organization to data exfiltration. Uh, Also, sometimes we don't know that AI is being used by specific vendors, right? It's embedded, and we don't understand how they're using the data that they're collecting from our users, and where it's stored and how long they're storing it for, et cetera. So that's another issue that we need to consider. And risk analysis today, assessments, we do lots of them, of course. That's one of the big things that we're known for. A lot of them stop short of, hey, let's understand how AI is being used within the organization and what the potential impacts could be to our company.
Yeah, yeah. I think you put it right when you said AI is exacerbating these things that we know are already an issue with technology in general. So one of we've got a couple things we want to talk about. That's being one of them. You're going to think about managing AI the way you manage your existing technology. You're going to see variations in risk with AI tools, of course, but if you don't start applying just traditional skills in traditional thinking in securing AI, you're going to be overwhelmed by it. You're going to be an analysis paralysis, and this is a good conversation to have with your executives when you're trying to explain why you need specific budget for specific things. We'll get to that in a moment. But one thing we will also want to talk about as a theme here is this concept of flexibility of approach. The final rule that we're currently working with HIPAA and the proposed rules adhere to this flexibility of approach idea. And a lot of people don't know how to use it, and it's creating huge problems. Now, HALOCK's got good reputation, a good relationships with regulators. We talk to federal and state regulators all the time. Erik and I often work for them on cases, on data breach cases, and this kind of thing. And what they tell us over and over and over again is people are not doing their risk assessments. You haven't thought through the likelihood and the impact of problems. So it isn't just that you're supposed to, so do it. This is how you get the benefit of flexibility of approach, where you're going to ask, oh, how do I handle multi-factor authentication with this tool if it doesn't have a traditional model of access? Flexibility of approach, do the risk analysis and come up with an answer that makes sense. And if an auditor ever comes in and says, "Hey, let me see that MFA on that AI tool that you're using," you want to be able to show something that adheres to your risk analysis. Otherwise, they're going to come at you. Flexibility of approach is armor that you use. We'll talk about that in a couple of ways. As Erik mentioned, we're well known for risk analysis. What we use is duty of care risk analysis, a method we devised that regulators have been adopting in the US and the EU to demonstrate this balancing approach. Did you look at your risk? Did you look at the risk to, in this case, the patients? And did you put controls in place that allowed you to still do your job? The burden wasn't too greater to you than the risk you reduced for the patient. Sounds complex when you say it, super easy when you do it. What we call a DOCRA. That risk analysis is the first specification inside the HIPAA security rule on purpose. It's to say everything you're going to decide here is going to be based on your risk analysis. So let's keep that in mind as we go through this. This is a fun one, Erik. The in the proposed rule, the idea of doing technology asset inventory and network management, network mapping is explicit, but it's always been assumed by an auditor from OCR. But why don't you tell us what you're seeing and what tools work?
Yeah, so as you pointed out, asset inventory has been a staple of any control set since the dawn of control sets that are published, right? It's usually policies and then inventory of assets, because how do you assess anything without knowing what you have in your environment, right? So it's nothing new. However, with the introduction of AI, it's more challenging because you need tools that are more aware of AI and where it's embedded, and it's used in different ways. So if you go to the next slide.
Do you have it yet? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So there, and by the way, we did a whole AI management approach webinar a few months ago. It's available on YouTube if anybody wants to go and check that out if you haven't seen it. It really dives deeper into some AI management approaches, but at a high level, there's kind of three main buckets. There are using native tools to kind of discover how people in your company are using AI. Think of like Microsoft and their Copilot. You know, they've embedded Copilot in pretty much every application that they publish now, and which is great from a user perspective. It provides a lot of functionality, but once you license those users, they get some capabilities that you may not have been aware of. So we have a webinar on AI management and also one specifically on Copilot, but this is also a way you can get visibility because Microsoft has embedded some tools and configurations to help you determine how AI is being used, specifically with Copilot. Then there is a category of these browser security controls. They're plugins that you would install in browsers. They go across multiple browsers. And think about your typical user. They're using, LLMs with chats. They're to interact with AI, and it's through the browser. So that's a very good way to get visibility, but it does leave a gap, right? Because now more and
Yeah.
more people are downloading desktop
Yeah.
controls that don't go through the browser, right? And now
Mhm.
you don't have visibility into what's going on there. I know I use a desktop, agent, right? So the third bucket is really AI purposed discovery and management controls. They do it a bunch of different ways. They not only have browser plugins, but they'll hook into M365 to see what types of apps that might have AI are embedded or allowed access into your environment. They get access to your endpoint protection solutions where they can get access to the logs and events to catch that activity that way. Really, there's also specialized teams and Slack sort of agents that are AI
Mhm.
aware that people are using. So there's a broad approach to how to get that information to complete your asset inventory.
Yeah, and this is really important too. We know these tools are evolving. I mean, the detection tools, the inventory tools. There's always lag, right? Because there's always some new way to be using AI in a way that the tools might not detect. But this is one of those fundamentals. If you don't have, to the point you were making earlier, any controls standard you see starts with this concept and relies on the concept of know where your stuff is. Where is your stuff? Otherwise, you can't control it. So be aware that these tools are available, and we'll give you Erik's contact information afterward. You can reach out and we can tell you what we're seeing that works, because this is all very new. Why don't you talk to us about risk management? I could talk till I'm blue in the face, but I think you're more concise about it than I am.
Well, the way I see risk management in the context of AI is it's really not much different than what we're doing today, right? It's
Yeah,
just you're evaluating different things and different variables around AI. And so if you're going to go to the next slide, please.
yeah,
Yeah. So this is the typical process flow for risk assessments. First, you have to have visibility. We do interviews, we do config reviews, we, look at different aspects of what's in use cases, those sort of things. And then we assess the risk of them. Okay, this is what we have. What's the risk to our organization, right? And then once we get through that, it's like, well, what are our options to control those risks, to reduce the risk, right? So how do we remediate, right? How do we enforce policy, those types of things? And then once we've done that, we get to the how do we monitor? How do we make sure we stay in compliance? How do we ensure that we have control? We're not having drift, et cetera, right? So
Yeah.
this process is no different for AI than it is for a normal risk assessment.
Yeah. What's interesting here is, and it's because AI develops in so many ways and so broadly that when we're talking about analyzing the risk, you can analyze the risks associated with security issues, with cost issues, with the reliability that we'll be talking about in a little bit, and just the governance, the governance of it. When you look at California's CCPA, they're proposing, it's very DOCRA based, but it's a very different way to analyze than a security risk. Where they're saying you're going to look at the patient's risk and you're going to make sure that the patient's risk isn't greater than the benefit to the patient. Uh, Still very DOCRA-ish, but they're all telling you you have to do this weighted test. And in terms of the control, if you've got a control and say the medical team comes to you and they say, hey, whoa, wait a minute, you're locking down our ability to use this important technology that helps us through surgeries, you can be able to say, hey, this control has a greater burden than the risk it reduces. We're using this AI tech. My wife is a bioethicist, so I get to hear about all this stuff going on in technology. And she's going into depth on the risk associated with robotic surgery. The risks associated with this is like right there, right. The benefit of having some capabilities, but the risk of letting a robot take out the tonsils or whatever it's doing, that it's cost benefit analysis. But that gets you a control that you know to be reasonable and is defensibly reasonable. All right. This now we'll spend some time on technical controls, but this one tickles me and we'll talk about why, but jump right in.
Yeah, so again, a staple of any control standard is vulnerability management, patch management. And honestly, it's been a problem for a while, just anyway, because generally there's more vulnerabilities than we have time to remediate and patch in a normal, reasonable amount of time. So what the security providers have been doing is evolving this, right? They've been involving vulnerability management and patch management to have solutions that not only identify where you have vulnerabilities, but now they're starting to test those vulnerabilities, see if they can prove exploitation of those vulnerabilities. Anybody that's done vulnerability management, had a cup of coffee with it, or that's your main job, you know that you can get sometimes a lot of results. You don't know necessarily if they're applicable to your environment, and you really don't have an idea if they're exploitable because a lot of those solutions require you to say, okay, well, the solution you're scanning from, I'm going to whitelist you to my applications and see what you can find. Well, now these tools are developed to be more of what we call a hacker red team type of approach, where you leave your security controls in place and it's going to try to see what it can exploit of the vulnerabilities that are identified. So then you know that, hey, if I've got these four things that I've proven exploits for with your security controls in place, well, you darn better well go and address those four things first. Right. So that's where the market is going. That's what continuous threat exposure management is all about, because, you know, a lot of time these control standards or the best practices are you have to do a pen test once a year. And that's great. You absolutely should. But what happens for the other 51 weeks in the year, right? You need to have
Yeah.
continuous monitoring and inspection of your external footprint, especially because that's what the attackers are doing. They're doing it day by day, second by second.
Yeah. This the reason why I'm smiling is so Erik and I have been on some cases where this is really rough because you can we've also been in operations before we were doing cybersecurity, so we sympathize with the pain of actually managing systems. And we've been on cases where you see vulnerabilities that were reported like a year ago that are highly rated that just still sit out there, and you know what's going on. Someone says, if I apply this patch, I could bring down this business application and I can't do that. And it just sort of stays there and gets old. This has always been a challenge. But AI has given us an opportunity to use these tools like EASM and CTEM processes around CTEM, sorry, around EASM, that allow organizations to use AI for their benefit, to actually start to probe a little more intelligently so that you get a better sense of what it is that you do want to take care of without saying, I'm in analysis paralysis and I'm just going to let this thing sit in the network for a while until a miracle happens and someone else solves that problem for me. But this is actually a big one that comes up as evidence on cases we work on. And AI actually is one of those things where we can say it can help in this case.
Yeah.
All right. So Erik, what do you think?
Oh, yeah. So for information access management and authentication controls, it's all about understanding your use cases of how you're using AI and then getting you the right subscription or licensing level to enable you to manage identities, to get visibility into how those solutions are being utilized, making sure that the activity is getting logged somewhere, right? So you can go back and take a look at it or do some continuous inspection of it. And you can secure those things properly, like, I want to turn learning off, or I don't want you to sell my data, or like stuff like that, right? Just very basic things. Um, we tie also with identity, you want to make sure you're using unique identities to authenticate people to AI solutions. You don't want to be using shared identities. You don't want to be using personal identities, right? Because you don't want data to walk when there's a separation, right? Whether it's voluntary or not, if it's a personal account, they have access. You do not. They still have access to all of the work materials that they utilize with that solution. So those are things to consider.
Yeah, yeah. And you touched on something that I think is really helpful, especially for people in a clinical environment. Um, when you talk about, knowing the use cases, why are you doing this stuff with data? And that should tell you an awful lot about who should get access and why and under what condition, what can they access. And if you're in a hospital in particular, one of the real advantages you might have to take the time, because you might think, look, there are so many things I got to take care of. I can't actually work through this information flow, which is a requirement of the new coming rules. Uh, your clinicians almost all know about a book called the Checklist Manifesto by a surgeon named Atul Gawande. And guess what it says? Just have your procedure, have a checklist. Every time you do a procedure, go to your checklist. If you find that something went wrong, create a new item on your checklist so it doesn't go wrong again. But if you say to any clinician, we need our own checklist manifesto, and the first thing we need to do is go through the process of who uses information where and why. And then that gives us everything we need to know from access management, authentication controls, use cases, asset inventory. But that's just write that one down. Atul Gawande, Atul Gawande, as it's spelled, the checklist manifesto. It's the best way for you to get budget approval in a hospital because they already manage the clinical environment using that book. Say, I'm just bringing it into my process. All right. So this one, security awareness training.
Yeah, this is actually kind of neat because obviously everybody has some form of security awareness training. You may or may not have a learning management system that you've deployed and you're using to track training. Well, now it's important for us to train our users and not assume that they understand the risks of using AI or know how to use it properly, right? We need to teach them. We need to at least give them some guidelines. And I hate to use guardrails because that's the AI thing, but where are their guardrails? Like what's acceptable, not acceptable? Now, even cooler is I've seen some of the LMS providers
Yeah.
start to incorporate their own capabilities to detect AI use and their own browser plugins. So then if they see a user breaking what your policy is or your guidelines that you provided them, it'll flag it and send them very specific training just to that person on what they did wrong
Yeah.
what not to, what to do if they need to report it, et cetera. But basically, on the spot training or just in time, if you prefer, on AI violations, which I think is really neat.
It is, so we were both in operations at some phase, but before I went purely into cybersecurity, I had this couple year period where I was doing internal audits. And my ethic at the time was, um, because you've been on the other side of these audits, help people find the best way to get a better outcome. And that turned into this whole risk career that we've done since. But one thing that was always happening every time we would do a human-based behavioral issue, no matter what we did for training, whether it was for laptop safety or, I mean, any leaving paper copiers at the, I never got better than 12.5% success rates on any human behavior audit that I ever did. And I used to say, how do I break the 12.5%? And when I started to hear you talk about this, Erik, I got so excited because I thought it's catching the people at the moment of their error, right? And it's not punishing them and humiliating them. It's just saying, hey, just keep in mind, that's such a great use of AI. From a former auditor, I'm very enthusiastic. All right, now this one is extremely important. The HIPAA security rule current has been trying to crack this nut since the HIPAA security rule was written. How do you get enough security confidence in your third parties that they're going to be following the HIPAA security rule? AI is so bloody seductive. People are doing things with it that is unsafe, and they just get so. It's not just that they're excited, but sometimes it's a company like Microsoft that provides you the tool set that you say, well, Microsoft wouldn't do me dirty. And guess what? I mean, Erik, you've got this great story about default configurations with Copilot to share.
Yeah, and we do cover this in our Copilot webinars again in detail, but basically Microsoft came to the table when they enabled their Copilot capability. If you're a licensed user and you didn't really kind of go back and secure your Copilot, the default behavior was any user could set up their own agent that you could connect to any of your backend systems and publish it on the internet without authentication or anything, right? So think about that. Like just your normal user trying to do their job and they're like, you know what, I want to do this thing from home without VPNing in or whatever. And they create this agent that has this connectivity that's now available there. It's a automated data exfiltration agent basically for anybody that can access it on the internet. It's mind-boggling that they
Yeah,
they did that. Yeah.
yeah, and it's Microsoft saying, "Here, this is
Yeah.
cool, right?"
It's
As
crazy.
if they didn't do any risk analysis. So
Right.
now the point that we're trying to make here is that AI is so seductive that someone as trustworthy as Microsoft has been reckless. I mean, that's just reckless. It boggles the mind.
It
You
is.
you had to not think at work that day when you said, "Let's launch this," right? But it's also true, of course, with small vendors. And if you've got this business associate concern, the contract isn't going to do anything for you because look at the contracts and the security standards that Microsoft touts. And they got something so extraordinarily big wrong, that the small organizations are going to have a hard time too. And now keep something in mind here. And the lesson here is just cool your jets before you bring on AI vendors. Just cool your jets. Take a breath. um, think this through. AI is allowing people to create applications and agents very easily, but it's not making sure that the people who create businesses with those easily created tools are any good at their jobs. That they thought through security, they thought through governance architecture on the LLMs and the agents, that they've thought through redundancy backups, that they've but when you're buying a service that's been built by AI, an application, for example, you can be very impressed and you could be given the impression that there's some real heft behind this. So you really want to go into diligence. The challenge is that your colleagues who are requiring you to help them secure business associate agreements um, are seduced by these very powerful tools and say, well, we're going to use it anyway. You're going to have to find a way. We call this governance, and we can help you with it if you need. But what you're going to have to find a way to show them the hazards of trusting. And maybe this Microsoft story is a really good example. We don't know who to trust, but people are so seduced by this stuff, they're being a little careless. All right, and transmission security, Erik.
Yeah, so we're all familiar with APIs and how you connect to them to get information from some source, right? And so, in the context again of AI, this becomes even more important of securing, evaluating how your APIs are being utilized, making sure you do have good rules about how your APIs can be utilized that are programmatically enforced, making sure that the people that talk to your AI are known, if possible. Sometimes it's just a general purpose AI API that, but if it's one of those types, then you need to restrict the type of information you can get through those APIs. So this is not new, but just again, AI makes it worse because again, less skilled people doing more complex things at faster volume. It's much easier to identify, find APIs that may not require authentication, that don't have an API key that you need to use to get access to the information, to actually protect yourself. And then the other thing that I just want to mention, and we're seeing more and more of it, and not to pick on HubSpot or LastPass because it's a global problem, but they had more recent incidents where they had their third parties that had API keys into their environment that were compromised. And then those API keys were then utilized to exfiltrate data, right? And so you got to think about how do I put some visibility, some telemetry into my API use to detect abnormal behaviors, big data exfiltrations, because most of the time your attackers aren't going to go, okay, I'm going to get a record a day, right? They're going to go, boom, I'm going to get all the records I can right now before they detect me and shut it down, right? And
Yeah.
that's what they do. So that's what you need to look for is those type of behaviors. And thankfully, AI can then automate shutting those APIs down when those
Yeah.
conditions trigger.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. So look, the HIPAA security rule is long. There are many specifications, more than we can discuss. So we went into depth on those things that are sort of more perplexing or challenging for our clients. But we want to address a few other things that are still interesting where AI touches the HIPAA security rule in a lightning round. Erik, I'm going to just fire away. We'll try to handle
Do
these
my
real quick.
best.
Yeah, and you can always go back and listen to the replay if you want more information, or definitely reach out to Erik and I. We're always happy to help with this. So, Erik, in terms of evaluation,
Yeah, so really quickly, AI introduces more things that you need to evaluate. There's different variables and considerations, right? First of all, understanding the use case and how it's intended to be used within your company or wherever you are, right? Where does the data reside? What are your global compliance requirements? Can that data be shared? How is it retained? Do they retain it securely? How long do they retain it, right? What happens is you separate with them. Do they keep the data? Do they have a BAA? These are all things to evaluate. Chris mentioned it, is the AI solution legit? Or is it one
yeah,
dude in a shack in his backyard that generated an agent and now is trying to make a little money, right? These are all things you got to look at from an evaluation perspective. And I think, Chris, you and I discussed like this is probably a whole nother webinar, like how to assess the risk of particular AIs and what factors to evaluate. I think this is a great follow-up webinar.
yeah, there is no easy evaluation. So, yeah, I like the idea of doing a separate discussion, and you could do it from a governance and technical perspective too. All right, activity review, monitoring.
Yeah, so you have to understand how the AI is being utilized. To do that, you have to have visibility. And to do that, you're going to have to lean on some new sort of approaches and solutions. Now, you may have some existing solutions that they're going to evolve and give you this visibility. But the important thing is you need to get it into, if you have a SIM or if you're using a managed NBR solution, we need to start building rules that alert on improper AI use. So then again, we can go and correct them and stop them.
Yeah. Not easy evolving, but
Evolving.
you have to keep your eye on it and work with your vendors.
That's right.
All right, workforce termination and deprovision.
Yeah, so for this one, we all have our provisioning and deprovisioning checklists, that originate from HR. They go to the IT team to provision accounts get access to the right tools and solutions we use. And now tying into that inventory management where we started with, which every control set starts with, we now have to have that AI inventory to make sure that we are provisioning and more importantly, deprovisioning in a timely basis access to the AI tools that we're supporting in our client or organizations.
Yeah, perfect. Contingency plan and disaster recovery.
Yeah, well, this is tough anyway, right? So like, I don't know if everybody has, I would say in the healthcare vertical, I would say their BCDR planning is probably top notch compared to some of the other industries, right? That because of the risk that's involved with not having it. But in the context again of AI, if we're starting to rely on more AI-enabled solutions or tools, we need to consider what happens when those tools are not available. I think you actually had a good story, Chris, about this.
Yeah, I'll touch on it because it's a lightning round. But keep in mind that new tech is often seductive, and people just say, "Okay, this is our new thing," without understanding that you still need a backup. Think about what happened when a lot of IoT was started to be used to monitor patients or to drip insulin or something. A lot of hospitals started to not staff up their floors with nurses because they said, "Well, we have these machines that do it automatically." And as soon as ransomware started to hit hospitals, you did not have enough nurses to take care of patients on the floor when these devices that they'd grown reliant on stopped responding. So you definitely want to be sure that if you're deploying AI, don't start making decisions that don't allow you a safe fallback, like getting rid of your nurses. I don't feel very good about that in particular because my mom was a nurse, so I'm still sticking up for my mom.
My wife is a nurse, so
Yeah,
absolutely.
hallelujah,
Yeah.
angels on earth, man.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is the last one here that we'll touch on. MFA has been around for so long. I remember the days when MFA was first introduced, and people were like, I'm not putting some authenticator on my phone. You're not paying for my phone use. You can't. And now everybody uses their phone for MFA, right? It's like ubiquitous. So there's no excuses anymore. Almost every solution provider has some MFA capability. You need to enforce it. It's just that's the bottom line. And you don't need a HIPAA security rule to tell you to do this. This is just common sense best practice.
Yeah. And what's interesting is the even though MFA was never written into the original security rule, the one that's operating now, and it is explicit with the proposed rule, OCR auditors have expected it for years and years and years. And you've had to demonstrate in your risk analysis why you didn't need MFA in certain places, why the cost benefit in your risk analysis was wrong, was not reasonable in order to demonstrate it. But they've had these expectations that are in the proposed rule forever.
Yeah.
So, all right, why don't you walk us through where to start? There's a lot that we've given people, but let's give them a way to get this done. Do you have the 180-day clock up?
Oh, you want me? Okay. Sorry. Yeah.
You're
So
better at this than I am.
okay. Yeah. So right. Start inventorying your AI tools now, whatever means are available at your disposal. If you don't have the means, you can contact us. We can show you some means of how to do this, right?
Yeah.
Identify where you may have some pretty big gaps between what's in the HIPAA security rules and where you're at, and make a plan, right? And start getting those gaps. Obviously big ones would be MFA, Identity. We want to get rid of shared identities across the board, make sure we have a good handle of our use cases, right? And then in the next sort of phase, you know, the BAAs, uh, AI vendor evaluations, documenting how you're safeguarding your environment and how are you validating that those safeguards are working, and then ongoing, repeat the process. Anything new that's onboarded needs to be evaluated, have proper separation procedures for not
Mhm.
only your employees, but also for your AI vendors, right? But really, you're going to have to keep visibility and monitoring the usage of this, making sure configurations don't drift, usage doesn't change, you don't have anomalous behavior. That's all part of the ongoing.
Yeah, and keep in mind everything you're talking about wraps up into this AI governance idea where you're just going to show that everyone knew what they were supposed to do. They had a way to do it. It was documented, a good process. And again, if you're in especially a hospital environment, Atul Gawande's book checklist manifesto is exactly what's going to that's the culture that your clinical team are running on. So you don't have to explain why you need to go through these documentation items or where you need to budget for them. Just say you're doing it in clinical. I have to do it. I'm regulated too. I've got to do it too. That's been a good way for our clients to actually get this get the budgets they need by saying we have to run cyber security and information security the same way we run every other part of our operation.
That's
So
right.
say the regulators. All right. So um, here's how to find us. Uh, you've seen us at halock.com. We've got a YouTube channel that's starting to stack up some of these videos that Erik, you and your team have really taken the lead on to help people just see really practical ways to get through a lot of these challenges. Erik and I are always happy to take your email. If you have a specific question about the technologies or the governance and risk management, we are happy to help you with both. You've heard us talk about HIPAA risk assessments, and we talked about compliance assessments for evaluation. You can see information at that website that we've listed, compliance/HIPAA. And then we're doing good stuff with AI risk management and governance that again, we should do that talk, Erik, on different ways
Yeah,
to
that'll
use
be the next one for sure.
evaluation. Yeah.
Yeah,
We'll talk about there are a lot of different uses for AI and a lot of different purposes for it. And it turns out there are a few different ways to evaluate those purposes in terms of risk. That's a good conversation to have. So, and you can always replay if the crunching of your lunch was so loud you couldn't hear all the wisdom that came from Erik and I today. You can always replay the YouTube video. Share it with the kids on a Friday night when
yeah,
movie night is coming up. Whatever you'd like to do, but it's good having you join us. We're really pleased that you did. Know that we're here to help you with this. Any of these things are getting really challenging, but we'll help you any way we can. Rosanna, do we have any questions that have come in? I know we've run a little long, so maybe we need to wrap this up. But if there are questions we can answer, we'd be happy to.
Yes, thank you, Chris. So thank you for those of you that have submitted questions. The first question is I was hoping the HIPAA update would create pressure for my CFO to approve AI security management, but the HIPAA update is delayed until next year. How can I budget for AI risk management now?
Well, like we said, everything we talked about, even though it has not been explicitly said in the existing HIPAA security rule, most of what's in the proposed rule, they've given you a roadmap for what to do. They've been auditing against that new rule for years. We've had our clients under scrutiny from OCR after an incident or a complaint, and the regulators come right out saying, let me see your asset inventory. And we pick up the security rule and said, where does it say asset inventory? And the auditors say, how can you have a comprehensive risk analysis without an asset inventory? That's a really good response. So what you need to be able to do is say OCR has been auditing to these new proposed rules for years. That's what they're going to hold us up to. That has helped our clients get what they need. So we appreciate the question. Anything else, Ro?
Yes. Next question is, and I think you kind of answered it in the preceding question, is I've been audited by OCR. They've been expecting the controls in the new security rule update for years. we need to follow them do we need to follow them anyway?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's yeah. So yeah, that's really the experience people have when OCR comes in. I will say that one thing that's helped our clients again is that flexibility rule. That's a specific part of the existing and the proposed rule. The flexibility of approach. When you do your risk analysis, you can state in that risk analysis what reasonability is. We've got a lot of material on duty of care risk analysis. You can look at that to see how that works, or look at CIS RAM by Center for Internet Security. That's a practical way to do that. But that flexibility of approach is going to help you come up with those answers as you're being audited to say reasonable, 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 even if it isn't exactly what's in the security rule. Yeah, those are great questions. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, and then for those of you that have asked, this presentation will be available later this afternoon on our YouTube channel. Feel free to view it along with other videos that are out there from Erik and others from the team. In addition, we will send you a follow-up email with the link if you don't want to go hunt for it. And with that, if there's no other questions, we can adjourn for the remainder of the day. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Erik, for your time today, and thank all of you for attending the webinar.
Yeah, we do appreciate it. Take care, folks.
Thank you for your time, all.